Have you ever wondered how silence can taste? Not the silence of a peaceful morning, but the kind that fills your kitchen after a fight, when words hang in the air heavier than smoke. I've lived through that silence. It has a flavor, bitter, metallic, like overcooked regret. I suppose that's what life taught me. Sometimes the things we cook with love are served cold by those we love the most. Thank you for being here, for lending me your time. Before I begin, may I ask, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? If it's not too much to share, I'd really love to know. Because stories, like food, taste different depending on the hour and the heart that receives them. My name is Amara Okafor. Once upon a time, I used to believe that love could be cooked, simmered slowly with patience, seasoned with care, and served warm at the dinner table. But I was wrong. Love doesn't always come back to you, not even when it smells like home. I was 30 when I married Chitty. A man everyone said was steady. He was handsome in that quiet, distant way, the kind of man whose eyes never really smiled, even when his lips did. He came from a family that spoke of manners, not emotions. Of status, not tenderness. Still, I believed I could melt that coldness with kindness. I thought if I cooked the perfect meal, he'd see my heart through the flavors. The first night after our wedding, I made pepper stew, my mother's recipe. The smell of it reminded me of home, of laughter and stories told around firelight. When I placed the bowl before him, he looked at it, sniffed once, and said quietly, "Too thick. You use too much oil." That was the first review of my married life. There would be many more. None kind. I learned quickly that in that house, meals weren't a gesture of love, they were a test. His mother, Mrs. Okafor, would taste a spoonful and hum in disapproval. Back home, we don't make it like this. Even the children, little Zina and Tochi, grew to copy his tone. "Mom, Daddy says you always forget the real way to make food." Every word, every meal, every sigh became a small cut. But I told myself, this is marriage. You hold on. You endure. You stir through the pain and call it patience. I remember that evening, the one that left a scar no one could see. The stew had just boiled over. I had been tending to Tochi, who was crying over a broken toy. The salt slipped from my fingers, just a little too much. When Chitty tasted the food, he froze. His face twisted like I had offended his ancestors. "This? You call this food?" he shouted, throwing the spoon across the table. I tried to speak, to explain, but he stood up, pushed the chair back so hard it hit the wall, and before I could breathe, his hand struck my cheek. The world went quiet after that. Even the children froze. For a second, I didn't feel the pain, just heat, like the sound of boiling oil in my ears. Then everything slowed. I picked up the fallen spoon, cleaned the table, and said nothing. Because in that house, silence was safer than truth. Days turned into years. I became what they needed, the quiet mother, the invisible cook, the woman who smiled for visitors but died a little with every dinner. My hands cracked from washing, my back ached from bending, and my eyes grew used to staring at the same wall while the stew simmered. Sometimes I'd whisper to myself, if I could cook a flavor for freedom, what would it taste like? By the time I turned 38, I had forgotten what my own laughter sounded like. Chitty still came home late, smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't mine. The children had grown. Zina was in college, Tochi hardly stayed home. The house was quiet again, the same suffocating silence that had aged me faster than time. That night, while washing dishes, my reflection in the window caught my eye, tired eyes, but not weak. It hit me, maybe all these years of rejection weren't punishment, but preparation. Maybe the world hadn't tasted my food yet, only my pain. The next morning, I took the money I'd been secretly saving for years, the coins, the tips from catering for church events, the few notes hidden behind recipe books, and I rented a small space near the edge of town. It was barely a cafe, more like a corner with a stove and a smile. I painted a board myself, Amara's Kitchen, Flavors of Heart. The first week, I sold nothing. People passed by, glanced at the empty tables, and moved on. I would sit there, staring at the door, listening to the ticking clock echo through my small space. But each day, I cooked as if someone might walk in, just in case the universe decided I'd waited long enough. And then one cold afternoon, a young man walked in. He was thin, maybe 22, camera hanging from his neck, eyes tired but curious. He looked embarrassed, almost ready to leave again. I smiled and said, "Looking for something warm, son?" He hesitated. "Ma'am, I don't have money today. I was just..." Hungry? I finished for him. He nodded. I pulled out a chair. Then sit. Hunger doesn't wait for money. He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that hides gratitude. I served him rice with pepper stew, the same recipe Chitty once mocked. He took a bite, closed his eyes, and smiled like a child tasting his mother's food after years away. This tastes like home, he said. Would you mind if I record this? I shrugged. If it helps you remember it, go ahead. He set his camera up, spoke softly to it, describing every texture, every flavor, the warmth, the spice, the story behind it. Before leaving, he looked at me and said, "I'll come back, ma'am. People need to taste this." When he left, I thought nothing of it. I'd heard words like that before, empty, kind, but forgettable. I cleaned the tables, locked up, and walked home under a gray sky, not knowing the storm that was about to turn in my favor. That night, while washing the same dishes, I heard my phone buzz. A message from Zena. We hadn't spoken in weeks. She wrote, "Mom, you're on the internet." At first, I thought it was a mistake. But when I opened the link, I froze. The young man, Ethan, as I later learned, had posted a video titled, "The Woman Who Cooked with Her Soul." Within hours, it had hundreds of thousands of views. Comments poured in, people asking where to find me, calling me the heart behind the flavors, saying my food reminded them of their mothers, their homes, their lost peace. That I sat there in the dark, tears rolling down my face, not from sadness, not from pride, but from the taste of something I hadn't felt in years. Validation. For the first time, someone had tasted me, not my mistakes, not my silence, me. When I woke up the next morning, the sun looked different. It wasn't warmer, but it felt like it was trying, like the light itself wanted to say, "You've waited long enough." My phone kept buzzing, over and over. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I saw the notifications, hundreds, then thousands. Messages, comments, even voice notes. Strangers were calling me, the grandmother of flavor, the woman with the golden hands, the taste of real love. I laughed, a small, trembling laugh that sounded foreign to me. For years, my laughter had been buried under chores and criticism. And now it escaped like a bird set free after decades in a cage. By noon, people began showing up outside my cafe. Some came from nearby neighborhoods, others had driven hours. They said the same thing, again and again. "We saw the video. We felt your story. Can we taste what he tasted?" My little kitchen that once echoed only with my sighs now buzzed with life. The smell of fried plantain, slow-cooked stew, and baked bread filled the air. Children pressed their faces against the window. Couples took pictures. Journalists scribbled notes. And me? I just kept stirring, smiling, serving, one bowl at a time. I didn't have fancy recipes or modern decor. I didn't need them. All I had were my hands, my mother's old pot, and a heart that still remembered how to love through cooking. That was enough. The first week was chaos. By the second, I was out of supplies before noon. By the third, I had to hire 2 helpers, Teo and Mina, young and full of energy. They treated me like a legend, but I told them, "No legends here. My dear, just a woman who refused to burn out." Every evening, after closing, I'd sit alone in the empty cafe, the same space that once felt too quiet, and watch the flickering streetlight outside. Sometimes, I'd whisper, "Mama, can you see me now?" Because somewhere, deep inside, I felt like she had a hand in this, like her spirit had stirred the pot the day I added too much salt and too much patience. Weeks turned into months. The name Amara's Kitchen started showing up in newspapers, then on TV, then in people's conversations. Someone said a celebrity chef mentioned me in an interview. Another day, a food brand offered to buy my recipes. But I refused. I told them, "You can't buy a story that was cooked with tears." Still, with every new customer, a small shadow followed me, the thought of Chitty. I hadn't seen him in over a year. After I left his house, we never spoke. He didn't ask about me, didn't call the children to ask where I was. It was as if I'd been erased from his story, but destiny had written me back, in a different ink. One quiet evening, after closing, I was cleaning the counter when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up, expecting a late customer. Instead, I froze. It was him, Chitty. His hair was thinner, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his eyes, those same cold eyes, were now tired. He stood there, silent, looking at the pictures on the wall, photos of me with customers, Ethan's framed video screenshot, awards from local fairs. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The silence between us was louder than any greeting. Finally, he cleared his throat. I didn't know this was yours. I wiped my hands and said softly, people rarely notice what they don't value. He shifted uncomfortably. You've done well for yourself. I smiled faintly. You mean, despite you? He didn't answer. He looked around, then said, everyone's talking about you. They say your food tastes like love? I finished for him. He nodded, avoiding my gaze. It does. I saw the video. The young man, Ethan. He spoke like you were magic. I laughed quietly. No magic, Chitty. Just pain, cooked slowly until it became flavor. He looked down. I came to say, I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, late, fragile, unbelievable. I studied his face. For a moment, I saw the man I once married, proud, ambitious, too afraid to be kind. But that man had died the day he chose anger over understanding. You don't owe me an apology, I said finally. You owe it to the woman I used to be. But she's gone now. He swallowed hard. Then at least, can I try your food? Something inside me softened, not forgiveness, not love, just the quiet strength that comes from knowing the wound no longer hurts. I nodded toward a table. Sit. Today's special is the same stew you once threw away. He sat quietly while I served him. When he tasted it, his eyes closed for a moment. Then he said, almost in a whisper, it's perfect. I smiled. It always was. You just never tasted it right. We didn't speak again. When he left, he didn't look back. And I didn't need him to. Some closures don't require doors, just peace. That night, I sat by the window again, the city lights reflecting on the glass. Ethan's message blinked on my phone. Ma'am, your story inspired me. People are asking for a second video. Can we film you tomorrow? I agreed. Not for fame, not for views, but because I wanted to tell the world something deeper than a recipe. When he arrived the next day, camera ready, I stood behind the counter, wearing my old apron. He asked me, ma'am, if you could say one thing to the world, what would it be? I looked into the lens and said, don't mock what you don't understand. Some people carry their purpose in their palms, not on paper. And some flavors take years of heartbreak to be perfected. He smiled. That's beautiful. I shrugged. It's true. The video went live that night. By morning, it had millions of views. People called me Mama Amara, the queen of comfort food, the woman who turned pain into passion. Journalists came again, asking about my journey, my recipes, my faith. But I never told them everything. Some stories are better left half-cooked, so people can imagine the taste themselves. Months passed. My cafe expanded. I hired more staff, painted the walls a soft yellow, placed a quote on the main signboard, taste of patience, every dish has a story. Every morning, I opened my doors to laughter, to strangers who became family. Sometimes, old women came just to talk. Sometimes, children left thank you notes in messy handwriting. And sometimes, I'd see men like Chitty, men who once broke someone's spirit, sitting quietly, maybe wondering about the women they'd silenced. I never turned anyone away. Because, deep down, I'd learned something the hard way. When you cook with bitterness, the food carries it. But when you cook with forgiveness, the aroma travels farther than you ever imagined. One afternoon, as the cafe filled with chatter and the clinking of plates, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Ethan. He looked different, older, more confident. He said, ma'am, I just wanted to thank you. I got a job, hosting a food show. And it all started here. I hugged him gently. No, my dear. It started the moment you believed a stranger's story was worth sharing. That night, as I closed the cafe, I sat outside with a cup of tea. The street was quiet, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. For the first time in my life, silence didn't taste bitter. It tasted like peace, like a warm stew after a long storm. I whispered to the night, sometimes, the world has to mock you before it can love you. Sometimes, the same hands that hurt you teach you how to heal. The wind carried the smell of my kitchen, spices, hope, and a memory of all that had burned and survived. And as the streetlights flickered on, I realized. The recipe for happiness had been mine all along. I had just been too busy serving others to taste it. They say every flavor has a memory, a trace of the hands that made it, the laughter that surrounded it, and the silence that followed. If that's true, then my cafe had become a museum of memories. Every table carried a story. Every bowl was a confession. And in the middle of it all stood me, a woman who had learned that love, when cooked slowly, can heal anything, but healing, I discovered, doesn't end when the pain stops. It ends when you stop waiting for an apology that may never come. It had been almost 2 years since that evening when Chitty came into my cafe. He never returned, but I heard from someone that his business had collapsed, that he now lived in a small rented apartment. For a long time, I thought I'd feel satisfaction hearing that, the poetic justice of life. But when I did hear it, all I felt was stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when revenge no longer has a place inside you. I remember one Sunday morning, I woke up before dawn. The city was asleep. The streets were wet from night rain. I made myself a cup of cocoa and sat by the window. There was a bird singing somewhere in the distance, a lonely song that felt like it was meant for me, and in that silence, I said out loud, I forgive you, Chitty. For everything. For what you took, and for what you never gave. The words trembled as they left my lips. But once they did, something inside me broke open, and it was beautiful, that day. I decided to do something new, something that wasn't about success, but about giving back what life had given me. I started a program called The Kitchen of Second Chances. Every weekend, I opened my cafe for free cooking lessons. Not for chefs, but for women like me, forgotten, tired, divorced, widowed, or simply invisible. They came with stories, some too heavy to carry, some too raw to share. And as we chopped vegetables and stirred pots together, they began to talk. About betrayal. About loss. About love that never came home. The kitchen smelled of onions and healing. Some cried quietly as they cooked. Some laughed like they hadn't in years. And I watched them, thinking, maybe this is what grace looks like. One woman, Ngozi, told me her husband had left her after 30 years. She said, I have no idea how to start over at this age. I handed her a ladle and said, start here. Start with stirring. By the end of the day, she had made her first pot of jollof rice, and smiled like a child tasting sunlight. Another woman, Clarice, came every week but never spoke. She had burn marks on her hands, deep, old scars. One afternoon, while making stew, she whispered, I used to be afraid of fire. Now I stand in front of it and breathe. That sentence stayed with me for months. As word spread, the cafe became something more than a restaurant. It became a sanctuary, a place where broken women found their flavor again. Reporters wrote stories, calling me the woman who feeds souls. But I knew the truth. I was only passing on what pain had taught me. One afternoon, while we were cleaning up after a class, Ethan, my dear friend who filmed those videos, came by again. He looked tired but happy. He said, Ma'am, there's a TV network that wants to do a full documentary about you. I laughed softly. Oh, Ethan. I'm just a cook. Who wants to watch a woman stir stew for 2 hours? He grinned. The world does, ma'am. They've watched you heal it, one spoon at a time. I agreed, but only on one condition, that the documentary would not be about fame or food, but about forgiveness. He promised. When the cameras arrived, I didn't dress fancy. I wore my old apron, tied my scarf the same way my mother used to, and stood by the same stove that had seen my tears. Ethan asked me, Ma'am, when did your life change? I said, the day I stopped asking why me. And started saying, thank you, life, for showing me what matters. He smiled. And what matters, ma'am? Peace, I replied. Peace that tastes like slow-cooked soup. The documentary aired a month later. It went viral within days. People across continents wrote letters, emails, even poems about how the story reminded them of their own mothers, their grandmothers, their silent heroes. Some said they watched it while crying, others said it made them call someone they hadn't spoken to in years. And that, to me, was the greatest recipe I'd ever shared, but with recognition came something else, the past. Sometimes, life tests your forgiveness to see if it's real. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cafe was closing, a woman came in, holding a small envelope. She was neatly dressed, soft-spoken, maybe in her late 30s. When she spoke, her voice shook a little. Mrs. Okafor, she said, you don't know me. But I'm Chitty's daughter. From his second marriage. My hands froze mid-wipe. I hadn't expected that name again. She continued, he passed away last week. I found this letter in his things. It's addressed to you. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. She placed the envelope on the counter, bowed her head slightly, and left before I could say anything. I stared at the letter for a long time. My heart pounded, but I didn't open it right away. Instead, I finished cleaning, locked the doors, and made myself tea. Then I sat in my usual chair by the window, where the streetlight flickered, the same light that had watched my story unfold. I opened the letter slowly. The handwriting was shaky, but familiar. Amara, if you are reading this, it means I have finally run out of time. I don't expect forgiveness, I just want you to know that I see now what I couldn't then. You were never ordinary. I mocked your food because I was jealous that you could turn suffering into something beautiful. When the world loved your recipes, I realized too late that it was never the food, it was you. I kept one of your old cooking spoons. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the only thing you ever touched that still felt alive. If there's another life, I hope I find you again, and this time, I'll learn how to taste love before it's gone. Chitty. When I finished reading, I didn't cry. Not because I didn't feel, but because I'd already grieved for him years ago. Still, a strange warmth spread through me, not sadness, not relief, just closure. I whispered into the quiet, rest, Chitty. You've finally learned to taste. The next morning, I placed the letter inside a small box with my mother's spoon and my first cafe key. I called that box, my ingredients of grace. Time passed, and seasons changed. My cafe grew larger, brighter, yet somehow gentler. I watched new generations come in, children who once ate my food now brought their own kids. Some days, I'd sit near the window, and strangers would recognize me, whispering, "That's her, the woman who cooked her pain into purpose." But I never corrected them. Because maybe that's what I was. Maybe that's what we all are, recipes written in the language of survival. One rainy evening, Ethan came again, older now, his hair touched with gray. He said, "Ma'am, they want to name a community center after you. For women entrepreneurs. Would you allow it?" I smiled. "Only if they serve food." He laughed. "Always food with you." "Always," I said. "Because food is how I speak when words fail." Before he left, he asked softly, "Ma'am, if you could go back, would you change anything?" I thought for a long moment. Then I said, "No. Because every burn, every tear, every mockery, it seasoned me. Without the bitterness, I'd never have learned sweetness." After he left, I locked the cafe and walked outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining under the lamplight. I tilted my face toward the sky and felt the cool air touch my skin, gentle, forgiving. For the first time, I realized that life doesn't reward the strongest or the loudest. It rewards the ones who stay kind even when the world laughs at them. That night, I dreamt of my mother. She stood in her old kitchen, stirring a pot, humming a tune I hadn't heard in decades. When I walked up to her, she smiled and said, "Child, the recipe was never about food. It was about learning how to love, again and again." I woke up with tears in my eyes, the sweet kind, the ones that wash away the last bit of hurt. So I wrote something on the chalkboard outside my cafe that morning: "Forgiveness is the final spice. Without it, nothing truly tastes right." People stopped to read it. Some smiled. Some nodded quietly. And that day, more than ever, I saw how deeply the world was starving, not for food, but for gentleness. Now, as I tell you this story, dear listener, I wonder where you are. Is it morning where you are? Or evening? What time does your clock show? And are you somewhere warm, or somewhere where silence feels cold? Wherever you are, thank you. Thank you for sitting with me, for tasting my story, for letting me pour a piece of my soul into your day. Maybe you've mocked someone's small dream once, or maybe you've been mocked for yours. Either way, remember this: the world will always laugh before it applauds. But when your truth finally rises, it will silence every noise. As for me, I still cook every day. Not for money, not for fame, but for memory. Each time I stir a pot, I whisper a prayer for those who once doubted, those who once hurt me, and those still finding their way home, because I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means remembering without pain. And when I close my cafe each night, I stand at the door, watch the stars appear one by one, and smile. Because somewhere, I believe my mother and Chitty are both watching, finally understanding the recipe I tried to teach them all along, that love, when seasoned with patience, never burns. Star.